I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Nick Pope, who worked for the UK Ministry of Defence and ran the British government's UFO project. He's a regularly cited subject matter expert on the UAP phenomena, including the US government's investigation of UAPs and UFOs and the AATIP and UAPTF programs. During the 1990s, Nick researched and investigated UFOs and a number of other strange phenomena, leading the media to call him the real-life Fox Mulder. His government background and his level-headed views have made him the media, film, and TV industry's go-to guy when it comes to UFOs, the unexplained, and conspiracy theories. Nick has consulted on and helped to promote a number of alien-themed movies, TV shows, and best-selling video games. He has hosted, consulted on, and contributed to numerous TV shows, has written 6 best-selling books, and lectures all around the world. He joins us today to discuss the UAP phenomena and offer insights into what, how, and why it may be occurring. So Nick, welcome, sir. Let me start out with your background. How did you initially get into the job investigating UFOs, or as we would call them, UAPs, for the UK Ministry of Defence?
Well, I fell into it almost by accident. I had no previous interest in this topic or belief. We joked in the family that the Ministry of Defence was our family firm, because my father was a senior government scientist, aeronautical engineer by trade, but finished up as the deputy chief scientific advisor, and along the way had done other things like be director of RAE Farnborough. So that was the world in which I was brought up, and I guess followed my father into the family firm. And as you know how it is in government and the civil service, I was a civilian employee there for 21 years. Every few years you get moved to a new post. You don't necessarily have much of a say where you're put. And through a combination of circumstances, I'd been seconded into the Joint Operations Center during the first Gulf War. I was working quite closely with a particular manager. I was due for a move, and he had a vacancy coming up, and that's how I got assigned to the job. A very unglamorous title, Secretariat Air Staff 2A, of course meaningless to most people, which is why we use these colloquial terms like UFO project, UFO program, UFO desk, whatever it was. But the Ministry of Defence had been informally looking at this since the Second World War, when we had sightings of so-called Foo Fighters, and formally had constituted a program to look at this from 1953 onward. So I was just one of many people who over the years had done this job. I wasn't sure at first whether it would be particularly career enhancing or not. We young, ambitious managers like myself wanted to go into the Secretary of Defense's office, that sort of thing. But I ended up doing UFOs, and I have to say, looking back, it was pretty life-changing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, could you give me an overview of this program? I mean, what were you guys really studying and researching? You mentioned that this goes back to the 1950s, and that makes sense. I mean, like there were sightings over Washington, D.C. in the 50s. There was a lot of Cold War paranoia. I think there was a lot of tension, and unexplained things flying around are going to attract attention, right? So, it makes sense that there would be an investigation and kind of a UFO desk. But can you tell me more about the program itself and what that included?
Certainly. And as you say, yes, every country obviously takes the territorial integrity of its airspace very seriously. Every government, every DoD, every Air Force says to itself, if there's something in our airspace, if there's something in with us, the UK Air Defence region, we want to know, who, what, and why. So it doesn't reflect, having a UFO program it's not conclusion-led. It doesn't reflect corporate belief in extraterrestrial visitation, though, of course, being data-led, we don't rule anything out. until we get resolution. So we simply go into this with the view that if there's something flying, we want to identify it. We got about 200 or 300 reports a year during my time. In some years, it was as high as I think 750 odd sightings. Many of them obviously fairly vague and obviously mundane, but you interview the witness, you get as many details as possible, and then you go through a series of checks and you try and correlate what's reported with something you either know about, like military activity, weather balloon launches, or something that you can find out about. So you try and match up the date, time, location, and description of the sighting with something ordinary, whether it's a satellite track, a rocket re-entry, weather balloon launch, military activity, astronomical thing. And you consult, obviously, all the military experts, you consult astronomers, you consult meteorologists. If you're lucky enough to get photos or videos, you can leverage intelligence, community imagery analysis resources and capabilities onto the problem. Radar is obviously another big part of our investigations. So at the end of the day, we ended up 80% misidentification of something quite ordinary, aircraft lights, weather balloons, satellites, meteors, etc. 15% insufficient data to make a firm assessment, 5% unknown. Doesn't mean that 5% is extraterrestrial, doesn't mean it isn't.
To me, it seems like it's very important to point out that these events don't happen all together. They don't happen at the same time. They kind of happen as bits and pieces, and then you have to backtrack and kind of fit them in, right? And you've mentioned only about 5% of these end up being completely unexplained. So there's a lot of data to wade through. And most of the time, it sounds like this is kind of painstaking work, just trying to match it up with known events that were misidentified.
It absolutely is, yes, and and there's a danger there as well, because sometimes you'll be doing so many mundane things. It's like, oh yeah, that was a weather balloon launch. Oh, that we had a military exercise and we were dropping flares, or oh, that was the night of the big Perseid meteor shower. That you get if that's your norm, which statistically it is, you can miss the important things, and you never know really when and where an important piece of the puzzle is going to emerge. So that's one thing. The other problem, and you hinted at this in your question, I think, is that there's a danger that you do all this on a case-by-case basis, but you don't do your trend analysis properly. And that was a big problem we had in the Ministry of Defense. Over the decades, it was clear to me that we had been too focused on let's get the next case, do the best investigation we can, get the result, and then move on to the next one. And what we weren't doing was looking for the patterns. And now, of course, back when I was doing this in the 90s, we didn't have necessarily the tools that we now have in terms of some AI systems, machine learning, computer processing power. It was in its infancy there. We now have the potential to do much more trend analysis. And I can't help but think that the devil's in the detail and that there are maybe some patterns in there. I mean, NASA, as they're talking about this study that they're now going to do into UAP, they said, look, we're not going to do a huge new thing and build lots of new kit and things. We're going to go through data that already exists. And I think that's a very interesting and potentially productive mindset.
Oh, yeah. Well, and, using new advances in big data, using AI algorithms and things like that, I think it's very likely that they may be able to find patterns that were basically just hidden in the noise in the past, So, yeah, I'm really excited about what NASA is undertaking, as well as other parts of the government. The data is already there, right? I mean, all of these systems, we're collecting, radar data, satellite imagery, we've got FLIR video. I mean, we have cameras and sensors everywhere, especially our military. And so that data is already out there. If we're able to process that better, maybe we will get some answers to the UAP phenomena that we weren't expecting, or, that were in front of us the whole time.
Yeah, I think so. That's absolutely the key to it. And the report issued last year by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence talked about the fact that these UAP are detected across multiple platforms, and said, as you mentioned, radar, FLIR, electro-optical, weapon seeker. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah. Well, so, I should ask what some of your best cases were. I mean, what were some of the ones that really stood out? Because again, there is all of this noise that you've had to go through. What were some of the ones where you said, okay, there's something here that stands out?
Well, I guess I'm going to have to mention Rendlesham Forest. It was before my time, but this was certainly our flagship case in many ways. It was December 1980, so I was not the original investigator, of course, but I did a cold case review, which turned up some interesting things, validated some things we already knew. Sadly, picked up some failings in the original investigation in terms of information sharing between the US and the UK. I mean, poor information sharing is hardly new, but it was disappointing, of course, to find in terms of the missed opportunity. But I mean, this was a classic case. It wasn't just lights in the sky. On the first of 3 nights, consecutive nights of activity, that something landed, some small triangular metallic apparently craft landed in a small clearing in the forest, was witnessed by 2 or 3 military personnel close up, but intriguingly left physical trace evidence in terms of indentations in the hard ground, burn or scorch marks on the sides of some of the trees, and most important from an evidential point of view, radioactivity levels recorded with the Geiger counter by the deputy base commander, who was one of the witnesses, and his team, and assessed subsequently by UK government scientists sitting in the defense intelligence staff in the Ministry of Defense as being, and this is a direct quote from one of the declassified documents in the case file, seeming significantly higher than the average background. So there was a lot. And as I say, it was 3 consecutive nights. On the 3rd night, the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, who was a complete skeptic, saw the UFO himself. There were some brief, fairly inconclusive, but they were there, radar data on the 1st night. We have, I mentioned, a declassified Ministry of Defense file. We have various declassified documents about this, the provenance of which are not disputed. So that was a great case, completely unexplained still to this day, over 40 years on. The best case on my watch was, we colloquially referred to it as the Cosford incident. It was a series of sightings over a period of 6 hours, March 30th and 31st, 1993, multiple police and military witnesses at several locations, large triangular shaped craft. I remember one military witness told me this thing went from a very slow speed of maybe 30 or 40 miles an hour to high Mach speed, phenomenal acceleration. He said, no sonic boom. And he said, Nick, this was, I spoke to him, I interviewed him over the phone the following morning while it was fresh in his mind. And he said, I've been in the Air Force 8 years, never seen anything like this in my life. So again, we launched a full investigation. There wasn't much middle ground with something like this. Either it's some secret prototype hypersonic aircraft or maybe early prototype drone, or it's something truly exotic. And again, we never got an explanation. Those are some of the cases, but there are more, and the ones that tended to interest and concern us most were the ones where these things were seen by our own people, particularly pilots, and simultaneously tracked on radar. So it's that again, the ODNI report talked about the corroborative nature of the best quality sightings, that you've got a pilot who sees something, a radar operator who simultaneously tracks it, and all the time it's recorded on the forward-looking infrared.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so how does this tie in with what's going on right now in the US? I mean, how are these phenomena, historically speaking, how are they related to the more contemporary sightings, right? I mean, the Nimitz incident has been in the news. You know, the sightings off the coast of Florida have made headlines. Is there kind of a direct tie-in with those? You'd mentioned the very high acceleration that was, you know, beyond what anyone would anticipate, I guess. Are there other factors like that where you can look back at your career and look back at the UK desk and say, okay, well, you know, these events here match up with you know, what's happened more recently in the States?
There's definitely a connection, yes, and I mean, you're absolutely right to mention the Nimitz and the East Coast incidents, and people are familiar with I guess the three best known U.S. Navy videos, and of course the 100% authentic. I mean, the DoD put them on their own website, as you know, with a press release saying that they're genuine U.S. Navy videos, and they still don't know the nature of the phenomenon shown. So I think there is a danger that we put too much emphasis on that. I mean, I often say the UFO community is betting the farm on those three videos, but it's not like there are only three videos. There's many more. People like Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp have brought some of those forward, but other people like Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon have talked about other footage that exists. People like former DNI John Ratcliffe have given public interviews where they've talked about satellite imagery of UAP. So there's a lot out there. So there is a connection with what we were doing in the MOD. And it's not as if pilots seeing and sometimes chasing and tracking UFOs is new. What's new is the fact that this is because of the release of those videos. And I think particularly the soundtrack on two of those three videos really makes it real and makes people think, gosh, if those Top Guns who fly cutting edge technology, if they say, as David Fravor famously says, I don't know what it is, but I want to fly one. If they're impressed, we should be impressed too. Now, Lou talks about these so-called 5 observables, the sudden changes of direction, the rapid acceleration, often with no sonic boom, apparently. Some of the other observables, he's talked about the so-called transmedium travel, the apparent ability of these objects to transition seamlessly from space to the atmosphere to under the ocean. Some of this has been reported before. Interesting case from Puerto Rico that had a FLIR video associated with it, for example. So it's not as if it's new, but it's the fact that this has gotten so much mainstream media attention, and in turn that all this, because the US government had told everyone, including Congress, for years, we don't do this and we're not interested, that Congress turned round, rightly so, and said, wait, you told us you didn't have a program. Now we find out you do. What's going on? And of course, my goodness, now we're up to our eyes in congressional briefings and one public hearing, but hopefully more to come. Intelligence Committee, Armed Services Committee, the House, the Senate, the Intelligence Authorization Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, and on it goes.
Yeah, well, you know, and it's interesting that you touched on that, because so in addition to that public ODNI report that came out in mid-2021, there was a classified congressional briefing. Now, reportedly, I just saw an article about this 2 days ago. They said that contained much more data. It was in much greater detail, and they said there were up to 14 videos in much higher resolution. So you'd mentioned the UFO community betting the farm on those 3 videos, right? But those are the 3, and I think we're all wise to keep this in mind. Those are the 3 that we're aware of. Those are what we know about. There are potentially 14 more, or at least, I don't know, 11 more. And who knows what else that may be contained in this report. So do you think it'd be accurate to say that the US government knows more than it's currently telling the American public? And what do you think the reasons they might have would be for holding back that information?
Well, I think it's like the magician's trick, isn't it? The magician is holding out 3 cards and saying, hey, look at these cards, pick one. And the magician, of course, is the US government here. So maybe we shouldn't be looking exclusively at those 3 cards. Look at what the magician's doing with his other hand while you're being distracted. I mean, absolutely. Look, those videos, it's a snapshot. You're seeing what they want you to see. They're seeing what they're showing you. But every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what we're seeing is a tiny little bit of the middle. We don't see the build-up. How did we get to that point? And what happened afterwards? Did they suddenly just lose interest and say, okay, let's turn it off now? Of course not. There's more. And there are more data, of course. And now sometimes there's very good. You ask why keep this back? Obviously, some of it is just methods and sources. Some of it is all the usual stuff that you don't want to because once you show the American people, you're showing Russia and China and everyone. So you don't necessarily want to give away things that would disclose the capability of your aircraft, your monitoring systems, whether it's radar, FLIR, whatever it is. So there are legitimate reasons for holding some stuff back. And it's not necessarily the case that the classified version of the report said something fundamentally different from the unclassified version. It's not like there was 2 versions and one said we don't know and the second classified version said, look, come on, it's aliens. I mean, that's not what's in the classified version. I think I can say with a degree of almost certainty. But obviously there, and I think people like John Greenwald at the Black Vault has made and continue to make Freedom of Information Act requests about that. I think he got a little bit of what was in the classified version released. I know that some other people are looking at this. Debrief magazine's looking at this. I think Warzone's looking at it. Lots of people doing real good deep dive work on this. But somewhere else in government, there's always someone who knows a little bit more than you. One thing I learned, even when you're the subject matter expert, or you're supposed to be, there's someone tucked away in a little basement office who you either haven't thought to ask or you don't even know exists, who's got a piece of the puzzle that you need. That's kind of where we are with this subject right now.
Yeah. Well, do you think the government is sharing any of this information with our international partners in NATO or maybe our closest allies like the UK or France? I mean, France has done numerous UAP studies of its own, and they've had a couple that were published fairly recently. Do you think that we have better collaboration with them than we've had in the past?
We have some collaboration, and I think Tim McMillan at the Debrief did a piece where he revealed that, and this was sourced for a number of people still within the US military intelligence community, and the Debrief piece confirmed that some UAP Task Force data had been shared across various classified intranet systems shared with the Five Eyes nations. Now, just because you share something on a server doesn't mean it gets to the right person in France or in the UK, and that the correct subject matter expert there necessarily gets to see it, because as you know, with all of this, the problem always is with the highly classified, deeply compartmentalized things, it's very often you don't get it to the right person. You don't even know who the right person is. So we're back to the person in the basement office again. So there has been some sharing across Five Eyes nations. There have apparently been some bilateral efforts between the US and, for example, Japan. The subject of UAP did come up at a bilateral, I believe, between SecDef and his opposite number. That may have been the previous SecDef, I can't remember, but so there is some liaison, but I don't get the impression that it's yet comprehensive. I think it's at the fringes of this. So there is more to do. And I don't have to tell you that even within government, if you look at 9/11 and FBI not sharing information with CIA and vice versa, and then you extrapolate that to a multinational situation, it's there's some degree of liaison, but not much.
Oh, yeah.
Not enough.
Yeah. Well, let me change topics just a bit. You mentioned Rendlesham Forest earlier, and if I remember correctly, I might be mistaken. I was under the impression that they had nuclear munitions on that base. And what I wanted to ask about was this nuclear correlation that Luis Elizondo and many others have now talked about. There was a book on this called UFOs and Nukes that I've studied, and my impression has been that there does seem to be some kind of a correlation with UAP sightings, UAP encounters, and actually our entire nuclear supply chain, going back to around 1945. Do you have any thoughts on this claim that Elizondo and others have kind of put forth?
Yes. Now, in relation to Rendlesham, which involved the twin military bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge, these were US Air Force bases on UK soil. I think I'm going to have to give you a boring answer on this, but it's been a while since I circled back with my former bosses, and I'm not sure that it's been publicly acknowledged. So I think I'm going to have to fall back on neither confirm nor deny in relation to the question of whether there were nuclear weapons there. But as you say, there's no getting away from the fact that Lou Elizondo, I think Chris Mellon and others, it was written into the National Defense Authorization Act. It's in the new Senate language, maybe the House too, for the Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023. The UFO and nuclear connection has certainly been highlighted. It came up at the House Subcommittee public hearing back in May with one of the questions relating to the Maelstrom Air Force Base incident of 1967. As you say, Robert Hastings has done a lot of great work in his book and the tie-in documentary, UFOs and Nukes. It seems to be a thing. I guess I'll just play devil's advocate. There is the preliminary assessment published in June 2021 by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence talked about the problems of collection bias. And they said that sometimes you get what appear to be UFO hotspots simply because a particular geographical area, is more heavily surveilled. And there are few, if you look closely enough, you'll find. And the more you look, the more you find. And there are few areas as heavily surveilled as nuclear facilities, whether they are missile silos, bases where there are nuclear weapons, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, nuclear power stations, whatever it is. So, yes, absolutely, Lou Elizondo is right to highlight this, and people like Marco Rubio and Kirsten Gillibrand are right to put it into the language of some of the legislation and say we should look at this and see if this connection is a thing. But we do have to play devil's advocate and ask ourselves, could some of that simply be because we just have more surveillance in those areas, so we're picking more things up? And if you randomly, as a sort of control experiment, randomly picked an area that is not currently heavily surveilled and put an equivalent amount of surveillance on it, would we notice an uptick in UAP? And until, I mean, that's a testable hypothesis in terms of the scientific method. You can have a hypothesis, you can devise an experiment to test it, which I just articulated, and you can repeat it. So there's a way to do it, and I think it is being done. If it isn't, I hope it will be. But absolutely, look, no issue could be more impactful than if UAP, whatever we're dealing with, whether it's Russia, China, or something extraterrestrial or something else, no issue could be more impactful than were it to be true that UAP are in some way interacting with nuclear materials, including weapons.
Yeah. Well,
so we need to find out.
That's incredibly important. What you said about collection bias, for me, that goes to another question as well, and that's why it just kind of sparked this. But a lot of these sightings happen near major populations and busy shipping lanes, and so the collection bias is another aspect of that. Are we seeing them more there because there are more people there to see them? Or is it because they are focused on people? And the reason I ask that is you have also done studies in abduction reports. And I wanted to see, do you think that those have, in your own mind, do those have the level of credibility that I think the traditional UAP reporting has? For you, are they as believable? And do you think that there's, again, some kind of a correlation with the UAP phenomena and what people have reported in terms of abductions?
Well, yeah, and just to round off your previous point, yeah, absolutely. The Mutual UFO Network sometimes publish a sort of league table of UFO sightings in the US, and everyone goes, "Wow, look, California have got more sightings than any other state." And of course, as you say, I mean, what you have to do with those data is factor in population density, and when you control for population, I'm probably doing them but I think it's Vermont turns out to have more sightings than anywhere else. But again, there are other variables too, and one important variable is how proactive, for example, organizations like MUFON are in a particular state. Do they make it easy for witnesses to come forward and make a report? So that's a factor. Now, to your question about abduction, look, I think I'm going to upset a lot of people here. There is no way that you can say that those reports are as strong. Now, let me qualify that. That does not mean they are not equally as true. I don't know whether people are or are not getting abducted by extraterrestrials or by something else, if the phenomenon is something else. But look, there's no getting away from the fact that just eyewitness testimony, stories, accounts, which aside from a few unscientifically tested in terms of peer review and publication in scientific journal, a few claims about alien implants are frankly just stories. But contrast that with where we are with UAP right now. And we discussed a few moments ago the ODNI preliminary assessment, where they said radar, forward-looking infrared cameras, electro-optical, weapon seeker, so simultaneously detected across a range of instruments. So you have data which can be analyzed, and that self-evidently puts you in a much stronger position than with the abduction reports, which are largely anecdotal. Are there things that you can test? Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I hear a lot from the UFO community is the disproportionately high number of people claiming these experiences who apparently have rhesus negative in terms of blood. So that's a hypothesis that is scientifically testable. I don't think it has yet been scientifically tested, and there's a problem, of course, in that just because somebody claims to have had these experiences doesn't mean they have had those experiences. Some of those people will be making it up. Some of those people will be misperceiving an experience as something else. Maybe they are misperceiving a very vivid dream or hallucination that then gets muddied through the lens of regression hypnosis, which many people say can distort existing memories and maybe even create false memories. So, but at the end of the day, let's not have it. That's my playing devil's advocate. But let me flip it and argue it the other way around. Even in this day of heavy surveillance with cameras everywhere and with crime solving being done with forensics and DNA analysis and all of that, let's not forget that eyewitness testimony still lies at the heart of our criminal justice system, and that most times you're up in front of 12 men and women, good and true, whatever the phrase is, and they simply have to ask themselves, does this sound credible? Whether it's the defendant saying, I didn't do it, I wasn't there, it wasn't me, or whether it's the expert witness saying, well, look, here's what the science says, or whether it's the eyewitness who says, oh yeah, I saw he did it. And it's the eyewitness. So there's more evidence for UAP than alien abduction, but let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, and let's not forget that eyewitness testimony is still at the heart of our criminal justice system. So people's accounts matter. Listening to somebody relay these accounts, looking at their body language, listening to the tone of their voice, looking them in the eye, that's still important.
Yeah, no, I think that's so. My takeaway there, I guess, would be it sounds like abduction reports are still very much in the realm of the subjective. So that's something maybe to kind of keep an eye on, right? And then just kind of keep investigating over time versus the objective. And as you've mentioned, we have, radar returns multiple sensor data, as well as eyewitness reports from trained expert observers, such as pilots and radar technicians and things like that. So, and
there's no way realistically that these people who are now dipping a toe into the subject in Congress, so that, it's fine. We should be glad that across the party divide, people like Marco Rubio, Republican, Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat, are coming together to say, we want answers on UAP. But the reason they're able to do that is they can frame this, and I think they're right to do so, in terms of a potential national security threat. And those people are not going to get up in front of the cameras or in the chamber and say, and next thing I want to talk about is these alien abduction accounts. They're not going to go there. So let's, and nor should they. We are taking small steps to destigmatize this. And I think when you have, as we have now, former presidents, former DNIs, former CIA directors, former intelligence community personnel and military personnel with sightings and with knowledge of these programs, talking about the events, the radar, the satellite data, you run the risk of losing what you've achieved if you say, oh, and one more thing, the abductions, because that's a bridge too far.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
At the moment. Now, maybe down the line that comes into the conversation, but I think it would be a mistake to try and bring it in now.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. You've got expert testimony and objective evidence. Now, I wanted to touch on the Galileo project also, and I believe this is Avi Loeb's, his baby, so to speak. And if I understand correctly, that's all about collecting more objective evidence. From what I understand, they've talked about using, like, literally setting up sensors. The goal was to set up sensors and cameras and try and collect more UAP data if they're able to, right? Because again, these things don't happen all the time everywhere.
That's correct. I mean, Professor Avi Loeb at Harvard is a hugely internationally respected, widely published professor, astrophysics, all sorts of published books, papers in scientific journals, etc. And he, I guess, first came to even wider fame when he speculated that the strange shaped object Oumuamua that was detected a few years coming into our solar system, he said that in terms of multiple factors like its changes in speed, trajectory, acceleration, he said seemed to be artificial and didn't behave in, and he speculated, could this be some sort of derelict extraterrestrial artifact, ship, a light sail, something? And he said, look, as scientists, we ought not to shy away from those difficult and awkward and sometimes perceived as fringe questions. Hence Galileo, who of course back in the day was very much considered a heretic and things, and now we know, of course, was right. So Professor Loeb set up the Galileo project. I'm not a scientist, but I'm honored to be one of a number of research affiliates. People like Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo are as well. And he's looking, he's doing a number of things. He's looking at existing data and things, but literally setting up new systems, telescopes, sensors, but also leveraging what we now are able to do in terms of machine learning, AI, algorithms, and I can't help but think science is going to be the key. So what Professor Avi Loeb is doing in the Galileo project is hugely important. And of course, not only what he's doing in Galileo project, but his role more generally, alongside people like Michio Kaku, as science communicators, scientists who the public can look at and listen to and say, wait a minute, now these people are saying it's no longer fringe or crazy to talk about extraterrestrials. And of course, we now have NASA ramping up to do a study on this. When you look at the legislation before Congress, at the heart of that legislation is the need for a robust science plan. So science is the key. And my goodness, of course, we have the James Webb Space Telescope out there now, and who knows what it might detect. I mean, people talk about, we've gone from talking about biosignatures now to talking about techno signatures, whether it's gases that might be the byproduct of a society that's gone through a sort of industrial revolution, or whether it's literally some alien mega structure like a Dyson sphere. But we are now, the science, the technology is just to the point where if there's something out there, particularly around a nearby star system, we might just be able to detect it. My goodness, exciting times. There's never been a more exciting time. We have in our hands the tools, perhaps now, to make that greatest of all discoveries.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, let me thank you again, Nick, for your time. It has been absolutely wonderful. It has been a true honor to have you with me today. So I want to thank you again. And let me close by asking, as these things move forward, what do you expect to come next? And what role do you hope to play in that?
Well, I think taking the second first, my role now I'm outside of government, I think is just that of a communicator. I am fortunate enough to have a large platform with the mainstream media. I will use that platform to keep this subject in the public eye and to keep it under the media spotlight. And if I can do anything, whether it's openly that or maybe behind the scenes to try and move this forward, then I will continue to do so. As to what more generally we can expect next, I mentioned, of course, NASA ramping up to do their study. That will be interesting. If I was a betting man, I would say expect further public congressional hearings, expect obviously more classified briefings and reports from the intelligence community and the military to Congress. Keep a very close eye on the Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023, which will probably get rolled into the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023. But most of all, and also more photos, more videos, we're going to see. I think that's inevitable. Maybe some more. I don't like to use the phrase whistleblowers because I think these people take their security oaths seriously, but more people with a background in these sorts of programs speaking out, at least within the bounds of their various secrecy agreements. But above all, expect the unexpected. Expect some development or document or photo or video or something to come at us suddenly and unexpectedly out of left field. The way in which the New York Times story about AATIP exploded into the narrative in December 2017 and flipped the narrative. So expect something like that and expect more of that.
Wonderful. Nick, thank you again so much.
Thank you.